having an okay day, but then I looked back here and I saw Kenny was back. So that's right. Yeah, man of your word. All right. Well, I've asked Brother Keith if he'd lead us in prayer before we get started. All right. We'll go ahead and read the context again of where we're at right now, and then we'll jump into verse 4. It says, "For every priest being taken from among men is appointed for men in things pertaining to God, that he may offer both gifts and sacrifices for sins, who can bear gently with the ignorant and erring, for that he himself also is compassed with infirmity. And by reason thereof is bound, as for the people, so also for himself to offer for sins. And no man taketh the honor unto himself, but when he is called God, even as was Aaron." And of course, just to kind of go back and just briefly explain what we went through last week. So, the priest was taken from among men. Of course, that was the tribe of Levi, and is appointed for men. So he's ministering for the people in things pertaining to God, that he may offer both gifts and sacrifices for sins. And of course, we mentioned that not only did he offer for everybody else, but he offered for himself. Verse 2, "Who can bear gently with the ignorant and erring," so those that are struggling in various ways, spiritually speaking, for that he himself also is compassed with infirmity. He understands what it is like to be human beings, so he knows what it's like to suffer, and because of that makes him, of course, going on to previous verses, that was also explained. It says, "And by reason thereof is bound, as for the people." So he is bound to this office. The priest was bound to the office, was to serve in that capacity, and so now Christ is bound in that way. And it says, "So also for himself to offer for sins." And of course, the priests were to offer sacrifices for not only the people but for themselves. Jesus is a perfect sacrifice. We see that, and he doesn't. He offers it for everybody else. Verse 4: "And no man taketh the honor unto himself, but when he is called of God, even as was Aaron." And so nobody takes it upon themselves. Sometimes there are people that try to self-appoint themselves into positions. They are vying for different positions, positions of authority sometimes, and all those things. But he's not trying to take honor upon himself. That's not what Jesus is doing. That's not what the priest was to do. That was given to him. That was appointed unto him. And so just as the priest and had to be a descendant of Aaron, but he also had to be ordained. Same thing here. Jesus didn't take the honor upon himself. He was given that. You look at it. We kind of mentioned some of. We're not going to go in depth on this, but there are some requirements for the Levitical priesthood. Mentioned one of those things last week, just in conversation. Of course, just some of the main characteristics. He was to be a man, must be of the tribe of Levi, must be ordained or called of God, and he was to offer both gifts and sacrifices. And of course, too, when you're looking at this, he was supposed to even to take compassion on those that were ignorant, according to verse 2. But again, God chose the priesthood in Exodus 28 and verse 1. It says, "And bring thou near unto thee Aaron thy brother and his sons with him from among the children of Israel." And so they were brought in. This was set up from the beginning. In 2 Samuel 12 verses 9 through 13, it gives us some more of these differences in the tribes and how that related. But anyway, moving on, it says, "So Christ also glorified not himself to be made a high priest, but he that spake unto him, Thou art my son, this day I have begotten thee." And of course, we mentioned this at the very beginning. And what is that being begotten of God again? What was that? Do you remember? Is that just simply, that he has, was and is the Son of God? Is that the direct reference? Well, no, it's not. The direct reference is not simply being begotten of God. Of course, he was born into the world as a human being. And we see in Psalm 2 and verse 7 says, "I will tell of the decree. Jehovah said to me, Thou art my son. This day I have begotten thee." And moving on, we know that he was born of the Virgin Mary. Of course, Luke 1 and verse 35. But this is a reference, again, to his resurrection. That was what we looked at before in Acts chapter 13. And verse 33, it says, "That God hath fulfilled the same unto the children, in that he raised up Jesus, as also it is written in the second psalm, Thou art my son, this day I have begotten thee." And so this is not a question of what this means. It is very much answered. This is about the resurrection. It's not, this is a quotation from Psalm chapter 2. That quotation is explained in Acts chapter 13, and there is no other way around it. Someone might say, "Well, I think it's this." Well, if you think anything other than the resurrection, I'm sorry, you're wrong, because it is already explained. This is one of those passages that there is no looking another way and trying to find a different meaning, and this is it. This is talking about the resurrection. We could, this is one of those things. We could make up all kinds of arguments as to what this means, but if we go anywhere outside of what is said in Psalm chapter 2 and Acts chapter 13, where we see this quotation explained, then we are going outside of the bounds of God. But yet, people will do things just like that, won't they? They'll look at the Bible, and we even mentioned this, I think it was last week, but it may have been a couple of weeks ago, where people will say, "Well, you know what, I think that this means this." And I remember giving an illustration that was with some preachers. I think it was at a preacher's lunch, and one of the preachers said, "Well, what that means to me is," and they said something to the opposite of what it meant. And I said, no, you can't do that. Words have meaning. You cannot change the meaning of a word to fit your situation. Words have meaning. And we have to, and if we're, this is where this kind of gets a little complex. Words have meaning, and we're not looking even at the original, here. It's been translated for us. Sometimes we have to look at the original to go, okay, well, what is the word mentioned here? Which this is pretty much anybody can do this. I believe it's BibleHub.com. Has anybody ever used that? BibleHub.com. BibleHub.com, I believe, has a kind of an interlinear thing where you can look at the Greek and the meaning of a word alongside. You don't have to know Greek in order to understand what the meaning of a word should be. That being the case, all that being said, we can come up with our own ways of thinking, but that doesn't mean that it's right. It doesn't mean that it's right and good even. So we have to be careful about that. In Romans 1 and verse 4 it says, who was declared to be the Son of God with power, according to the Spirit of holiness, by the resurrection from the dead, even Jesus Christ our Lord. So this is all, again, talking about the resurrection. Now also, we know some things, and I don't want to skip too far ahead, but we know that he became a priest after his resurrection. According to Hebrews chapter 7, verse 12, it says, for the priesthood being changed, there is made of necessity a change also of the law. In Hebrews 8 and verse 4, now if he were on earth, he would not be a priest at all, seeing there are those who offer the gifts according to the law. So, he did not become high priest until after his death. And I think that's a significant thing to remember as we're moving forward here. But anybody have any questions before going to verse 6?
Yeah, we also become priests after our death and rebirth.
Yeah. Yeah. And of course, just think about that. There's we've talked about the priesthood a lot, but we may be priests, but we're not a high priest. So that's the difference. Because sometimes we get confused about that. I know. We'll talk about one thing and use it synonymously, just talking about the priesthood and talking about the qualifications of the high priest. But we may be able to do that as far as the priesthood is concerned, be a part of the priesthood, but Jesus is high priest. Anybody else have any comments? Good comment, by the way. All right, verse 6. As he saith also in another place, thou art priest forever, after the order of Melchizedek. And so this is where we start getting into some good stuff here, some good conversation. This is a quote from Psalm 110 and verse 4. Melchizedek was the king of Salem, mentioned as the king of peace and priest of the Most High God. But of course we know that he was not a descendant of Levi, but was a king. And of course when we see Melchizedek, this is before, this isn't in the days of Abraham, and this is before the priesthood is set up. And so this is why this is very interesting. And if you go back and you look at what happens with this Melchizedek, and we'll probably get into this a little bit more later, but when we see Melchizedek, he pops up and then he goes away, and then that's it. And then if you were to read through the Bible, and which this is I love doing this because I've when you read through from Genesis to Revelation, and you're looking through the Old Testament. Now, some things are not in chronological order. I understand that. But when you first start off and you're looking at it, if you just look at it from the eyes of someone who's just picked up a book, they've never heard anything from it, and then you start reading it and trying to think like someone who hasn't heard of any of this stuff before, and you read it just as they would, you're going to see people and go, well, who is that? Who is that? And Melchizedek comes up, and if you were to write a novel, and you pulled up a person that just jumps up in the middle of things and disappears almost as fast as he appears, you probably even wouldn't name him. Like it's like, some random guy comes up and does this thing and then goes away. But Melchizedek had a purpose, right? There was a good reason to put his name in there. And so anyway, at that time, Abraham then does the tithing, which is interesting. And like I said, we'll talk about that more later. But he is not a Levite. Of course, this is before that. And he could not become a priest. But you look at Hebrews 7 and verse 14, it says, for it is evident that our Lord hath sprung out of Judah, as to which tribe Moses spake nothing concerning priests. So when we get into chapter 7, we're going to have a long conversation here about this. It's going to keep coming up for a little bit, but Melchizedek pops up and just shows up as no genealogy, nothing, no history here. You don't know anything about him, and yet Abraham is like, oh, here's the king of Salem. Here is this person. I'm going to go ahead and pay tithes to him. There, here's a priest. I need to pay tithes to the priest. Now, for you Bible geography people out there, where is Salem? Jerusalem, right? There's Jerusalem goes through many names until it hits Jerusalem. You had Salem, and then you had Jerusalem, and then it turned into Jerusalem. So there's some interesting history there. So you've got this man who is the king of Salem, which is Jerusalem today, and he calls himself a priest. Verse 7. Let me make sure. I'm going to look at my notes before I move on. Verse 7. Here's another interesting thing. If you look at verse 6, when you look at this quotation here, it says, "Thou art a priest forever." When you look at this, forever was not said of anybody else. Forever, when you look at Aaron was not a priest forever. The Levitical priesthood was just throughout the Mosaic age. It is ended. It is done. There are no priests according to the Levites. There are people that would say, "Oh no, it's still true, right?" You're still, maybe people can. I don't know if this is possible, but maybe people can still trace their lineage back to Aaron. I don't know. I don't see why that's entirely impossible. But when you think about Levi, that tribe, maybe people understand, yes, I am, from that tribe, on down the road. Maybe people really think that. No matter what, we know, and especially even from Hebrews chapter 9, 15 through 17, that we have a new covenant. We're not under an old covenant. And so guess what happened to that priesthood, whether or not people think that they can still practice that today or not? It's gone. It's gone. It's done. They may think, hey, yes, I am going to still be a priest, for the Jews. Sorry, it's gone. It doesn't work that way anymore according to the Scriptures. So when you think of the Aaronic priesthood, that had an ending point. It was done. But what happens with Jesus? He is a priest. How long? Forever. So, any comments before we move on to verse 7? Who in the days of his flesh, having offered up prayers and supplication with strong crying and tears unto him that was able to save him from death, and having been heard for his godly fear, though he was a son, yet learned he obedience by the things which he suffered, and having been made perfect, he became unto all them that obey him the author of eternal salvation, named of God a high priest after the order of Melchizedek. So let's look at verse 7 here. It says, this, of course, it says, who in the days of his flesh, who's that talking about? That's still talking about Christ. And it's not talking about Melchizedek. This is all in the context. Melchizedek just popped up in that quotation. This is talking about Jesus. And it says, in the days of his flesh, it says, having offered up prayers and supplication with strong crying and tears unto him that was able to save him from death. Does that sound familiar? That sounds an awful lot like something that Jesus did when? In the garden, right. So this indicates, that there's, that, during the time that Jesus was on the earth, he is, crying out. He's offering up, cries unto God. If you look at Isaiah 53, of course, we looked at that a few weeks ago in a sermon. In Isaiah 53, verses 10 through 12, it says, "Yet it pleased Jehovah to bruise him. He hath put him to grief. When thou shalt make his soul an offering for sin, he shall see his seed. He shall prolong his days, and the pleasure of Jehovah shall prosper in his hand. He shall see the travail of his soul, and shall be satisfied. By the knowledge of himself shall my righteous servant justify many, and he shall bear their iniquities. Therefore I will divide him a portion with the great, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out his soul unto death, and was numbered with the transgressors. Yet he bare the sin of many, and made intercession for the transgressors." Of course, he, talked about he poured out, basically all this strong crying and tears. He's pouring out his soul in agony. And of course, we mentioned, this is probably a good reference there to, his crying out in the garden. But we know, God was able to save him, but God let him suffer for us. God let him suffer so that we could live. God heard him.
That's something there too. Talking here a while back about someone said that they were hurt because God didn't answer their prayers.
Yeah.
I said, well, maybe God answered your prayers, just when it wasn't the way you wanted. Christ, praise be him. God answered his prayer.
Yeah.
He heard it.
Yeah.
Said he heard it. He didn't help him.
Yeah. Yeah. Listen, I'm not a country music fan. I know that probably hurts some people's feelings, but I'm not a big fan of that. I like a little bit of everything, here and there. There are some things I just don't touch, but I'll listen to a few country songs. I grew up listening to it, so I know a bunch of them. And I remember a song about God not answering prayers, and sometimes people would even quote that song. I've heard that song quoted so many times. But yeah, there's a little problem with that. God can answer our prayers, but it doesn't mean that He's going to answer them in the way that we want them to. That's sometimes that's a hard thing. But just think about it this way. I've thought about this. There was someone I dated, in my freshman year of college, and I thought, this is the one right here. I need to hold on to her. This is the one. And several things happened in that relationship, and I remember thinking, praying, just let this work out, because this is good. This is a good thing. And the reason it didn't work out, but the reason is guess what? I had something better around the corner. And I tell you what, I don't know about you. You've probably done this same thing. If you had any relationships before you got married, you go, whew, I am glad that did not work out. Man, I am thankful. I did not know how good it could be. But let's say, here you go. Here's another country song for you. Maybe questionable country, I guess, but Rascal Flatts, God Bless the Broken Road, right? God bless the broken road that led me straight to you. That's a little better off right there. There's some hardship that goes through life, and you may pray for something, and I've learned that sometimes you pray for something and you may want something very badly, and then you find out, there is something way better around the corner. I don't know if I've ever said this, but there was a congregation that I wanted to work with before coming here, and I just prayed about it. This is a good little congregation, and I thought, man, it just was not going to work out. Things were not lining up as far as when they needed somebody, And as far as even support, they couldn't really support my size family. So, but you know what? I've been very blessed. I wouldn't go back and change anything. I love being here. I love the brethren here, and I wouldn't go back and change that. So God does answer our prayers. We may just not get the answer that we want. In James 1 and verse 6, speaking of prayer, it says, "Below him ask in faith, nothing doubting, for he that doubteth is like the surge of the sea, driven by the wind and tossed." So we need to remember that when we're asking of God, we ask in faith. We don't doubt. So many people doubt when they pray, and they'll pray about someone with terminal cancer, and they're like, "Well, he's going to die. There's just no way that this person's going to live." And then we'll hear someone pray, to be with this person, help, lengthen their days. And in their mind, they're even praying that, thinking, this guy's not going to live, past tomorrow. That certainly isn't the way to pray. When you pray to God, you ask in faith. Sometimes people are like, well, because I've had this one, because I'll say something like this and say, "Well, are you praying for a miracle?" No, I'm praying for providence. Do I think that doctors have everything down? No, I don't. I think I could give you a dozen reasons why I don't believe that. Do I think that people talk about science these days? They don't even understand science. Science changes. Science changes. The word science means knowledge. Guess what? Knowledge changes. There was a time when people thought that there was a good number of people that thought that the earth was flat. We know different these days. I guess evidently there are some people who think the earth is flat today, right? But those are some cool drawings of that world that's global, But anyway, you think about that. Science has come a long way. I mean, we've thought a lot of things differently than what they truly are. I mean, the first guy, we think this is crazy today, but the guy that introduced hand washing to the medical field, he was ousted as a doctor. You realize that? They used to go and they would do their autopsies in the morning, and they would go deliver the babies later. And they're like, "Well, how in the world, why are all these babies dying?" And this one doctor would wash his hands after doing the autopsies, and he'd go, and all of a sudden, his babies were living. That is weird. How the babies and the mommies were fine. Why is that? Well, you just need to wash your hands.
A lot of things we can say about prayer. We spend lots and lots of time, but like we said, God doesn't always answer the way we want it.
Yep.
But we live in a day and age that we want an instant answer.
Yes.
Some of his answers aren't necessarily yes or no. They're just hang loose here a little bit.
Yeah.
Wait.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Yeah.
and we don't live like that.
And we don't. And there's not a direct line to God to go. Are you doing this one for me? Is this one yes or no? Or yeah. And we don't have that. Nor do we really need that. But yeah, when it comes down to it, we're not praying for a miracle. We're just praying for, providence work out. Maybe there's some way that this person is going to get what they need. Maybe it is that, their body's going to react to the medicine that's already in their body and they're going to get better. I don't know. I'm not asking for a miracle. I'm just praying for providence.
Believe what you're praying for.
Yeah, you got to believe in that, what you're praying for.
Believe it by what you pray.
That's right. That's right. You got to believe in what you're saying. So going back here to verse 7. So he cries out with tears, and it says, and having been heard for his godly fear, he respected the Father. He was respectful, and he was heard. And but it says, verse 8, though he was a son, yet learned obedience by the things which he suffered. And so he learned obedience. He learned in the face of persecution by actual experience. He was always obedient. In Hebrews chapter 10, verses 5 to 9, it says, "Wherefore, when he cometh into the world, he saith, Sacrifice and offering thou wouldest not, but a body didst thou prepare for me, and whole burnt offerings and sacrifices for sin thou hadst no pleasure. Then said I, Lo, I am come, in the roll of the book it is written of me, to do thy will, O God, saying above sacrifices and offerings and whole burnt offerings and sacrifices for sin thou wouldest not, neither hadst pleasure therein, the which are offered according to the law. Then he said, Lo, I am come to do thy will. He taketh away the first, that he may establish the second. And so, he has, gone through all this suffering, and he is obedient. He's obedient all the way to the point of death, and he's not doing his will, but he's doing the Father's will, right? That's what he's always set out to do. And so by the things which he suffered so much in order that he should yield to the suffering and teach us obedience. In Philippians chapter 2, verses 5 through 9, it says, Have this mind in you, which was also in Christ Jesus, who, existing in the form of God, counted not the being on an equality with God a thing to be grasped, but he emptied himself, taking the form of a servant, being made in the likeness of men, and being found in fashion as a man, he humbled himself, being obedient even unto death, yea, the death of the cross. Wherefore also God highly exalted him, and gave unto him the name which is above every name. And of course, we remember at the beginning of this class talking about the Son and the relationship of in Jewish society of the Son and the Father, and that the Son and the Father were on equal playing field. It was a good thing to have a son. You had the daughters, but the sons were, in that society, they were the more important ones based on a number of things. But here it is, he's supposed to be equal with the Father, and yet in this passage, what does it say? He didn't count himself equal with God. He humbled himself. So he brought himself low. He became man. And so that's an interesting thought right there. When we see that and we understand the whole context, he has humbled himself in the form of man. When we talk about human beings, we don't really talk about that in a positive sense when it comes to the Bible. When we talk about the flesh, what is the flesh associated with? A lot of times we see in Scripture, sin, weakness, frailty. So all these things are dealing with the weakness of humanity, and yet God, Jesus, humbles himself. Instead of being equal with God, which he very well could have held on to, he humbled himself, became like a man. Hebrews chapter 2, verse 9, But we behold him who hath been made a little lower than the angels, even Jesus, because of the suffering of death, crowned with glory and honor, that by the grace of God he should taste of death for every man. And then, of course, in Hebrews 4 and verse 15, as we studied about last week, For we have not a high priest that cannot be touched with the feeling of our infirmities, but one that hath been in all points tempted like as we are, yet without sin. So of course he suffered, and he suffered in many ways in which we will not suffer, and he learned obedience that way. It says, And having been made perfect, he became unto all them that obey him the author of eternal salvation. And so we don't want to look at this in the wrong way. Jesus was already perfect, but so this is not saying that he was imperfect, but he had not yielded at that point. He hadn't suffered. He hadn't gone through all that yet. That was the perfection, the completeness of what we're talking about here. In 1 Peter 1 and verse 7, it says, That the proof of your faith, being more precious than gold that perisheth through, though it is proved by fire, may be found unto praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. And so just as we are proved by fire, that is what Jesus had to deal with as well. That is how he was made perfect. And he became the author of eternal salvation, because he is the provider of that. He suffered and died and resurrected, and then gave out the message, that great commission, that we can all be saved. That is how, he has become the author of eternal salvation. And again, when we look at this passage, we have to remember this key phrase here. What is it? He's became the author of eternal salvation, but first, what do we see? It says, unto all them that obey him. I will preach this to the end of my days, but we cannot ever give allowance for anything outside of obedience. Sometimes people will want to give an allowance to somebody, like we mentioned before, the good old boys, got that good old boy religion. Oh, that person, that's just a great person to be around. Because of that, you know what? God surely isn't going to, let a person like that go to hell. But look, we have to be obedient. We have to be obedient. We have to follow his will. We have to do what he has said. I don't know what we got. Like a minute. Is that what we got?
3.
We got 3 minutes. All right, we'll finish up with verse 10 here. Named of God, a high priest after the order of Melchizedek. So, he was named of God, called of God to be a high priest. That was already mentioned in the previous passages. But of course, the thought was, he wasn't bringing glory upon himself to do this. God was giving it to him, but he was called by God, and therefore, the implication is, therefore, who should accept him? Well, everyone, but specifically, we're writing to the Hebrews here. The Hebrews, the Jews, those people, they should accept him because God has named him a priest after the order of Melchizedek. I think we'll end right there and start with verse 11. That'll give us a nice little section to start with next time. Does anybody have any comments as we close out? All right. Well, thank you for your kind attention.